Hi, I'm Caro Perez-Heydrich. I'm a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences, and I'm the coordinator of the public health program where I teach courses in epidemiology, biostatistics, immunology, and public health. My background's in infectious disease epidemiology as well as biostats.
And I'm Amy O'Keefe. I am a professor in the History, Political Science, and International Studies department. And my area of expertise is modern Chinese history, specifically the 20th century, and Protestantism and what Protestants were writing about family. So as somebody who studies kind of transnational flows of ideas, I'm very interested in global history.
Yeah, so Amy and I got together because Amy approached me about potentially teaching a history of pandemics class, and I was like, yes, I would love to do that. I'm so interested in learning more about the history of pandemics over time. And particularly like now that we're going through a pandemic, as we started talking about this, it was apparent to us that a lot of the things that had happened in previous pandemics just continue to happen. And in particular, you know, the collective response to the pandemic has been something that's been there have been a lot of commonalities over time.
And some of the patterns that we see include the spread of misinformation. This is something that has happened in multiple pandemics in the past.
In fact, the WHO has a term for it now, which is called an infodemic, right? Sort of like it's almost like treating it like an infectious disease, right? So it's an epidemic of misinformation.
Some of the other patterns that we've noticed have been conspiracy theories arising about the causes or the spread of epidemics, and also hateful scapegoating of minorities or immigrants. We can see some of this racial scapegoating in the Black Death, the plague that swept through Europe in the 14th century, well, around the world really, in the 14th century. And at that point, Jews were really targeted, and there were terrible pogroms in which whole villages were killed because they were assumed to be the spreaders of the disease. More recently, we've seen racial tensions in times of disease related to colonial power structures. So one thing that I've been reading about is the plague epidemic that arose in the very early 20th century, around 1901 to 1903, in Vietnam, in Hanoi. And there, the French authorities assumed that it was the Vietnamese or the Chinese living in Hanoi who were sort of unhygienic, and that would be where disease would spread. But it turns out that the story was more complicated than that. So some of the aspects of modernization and of colonialism ended up really contributing to the spread of this disease. So for instance, the more efficient shipping that was helping to sort of globalize the world during this period meant that rats that carried the fleas that spread the plague were going from port to port. But another kind of interesting detail about this case is that the French created a modern sewage system in Hanoi in the hopes that it would carry impurities out of the city. But in fact, what it did was it created a safe place for rats to live underground. This sewage system became this really kind of perfect safe environment for them without predators, where they could multiply and eat. And so against their expectations, the plague actually arose first in the French part of the city where the sewage system was best.
Right, where it was more developed. But you were talking about misinformation, and particularly like the racial scapegoating, and we do still see that. Like we saw that with COVID, right? The fact that the virus was called the Wuhan virus, right? That's an example of scapegoating and xenophobia in a way. With the Ebola pandemic that occurred in like 2014, not that long ago, here in the US, you had cases of that sort of racial scapegoating. Once the virus finally made its way to the US, one of the people who was infected was part of this Liberian community in Texas, I think it was. And so then obviously like they started getting a bad reputation. There was stigma associated with the community and everything. So we still see these sorts of things. So it's not just the racial scapegoating, it's misinformation associated with that like sort of like distrust, right? Academically, I find it interesting because you can think about misinformation as sort of like as a pathogen itself, right? Like as this like information contagion where the information is, this misinformation is spread from person to person across populations and stuff. So like academically and from that epidemiologic point of view, it's kind of like cool to think about, or interesting to think about in that context. And in fact, like lots of people, scientists are actually looking at the dissemination of misinformation through this epidemiologic lens. When we're dealing with a pandemic, what we need most is that sort of like unified response, right? Where everyone's kind of working together towards this goal. And misinformation divides us.
Yeah, and I just want to say I'm so excited to be exploring this with you. I feel like we've talked about the fact that neither of us is a medical historian, but just this ability to learn together about this topic that's of so much interest. I've been doing some reading about cholera and a cholera outbreak in Liverpool, England. And in 1832, there was a series of riots that occurred because of misinformation that was spread about the cholera outbreak that was happening there. And there's misinformation happening on kind of two levels here. One is that the kind of medical and political establishment withheld some information about the cholera outbreak. So the city's Board of Health was responsible for producing like certification that ships were clean of disease and ready to go. And every time that they did this for a ship, they were paid for it. So they had this sort of financial motivation.
Conflict of interest,
yeah. A little conflict of interest. And in addition, they knew that if they allowed ships to continue their shipping business, that would bring more money into Liverpool. So it was, declaring an outbreak of cholera was going to have some negative effects on the economy, and this is, I think, a theme that we're really seeing in our current pandemic. So that's one piece of misinformation, was just withholding the information that there was an outbreak happening.
Like that same thing actually also happened in here in the U.S. in San Francisco in the early 1900s. What happened there, and it's similar to what's happening now, right? Where there was a case of plague that was identified, but the information was there was like a gag rule on the information going out, right? So, and part of that was because the governor didn't want to impose any sort of like sanctions or quarantines or anything to like cut off part of that city because of the financial implications, right? The economic ones. So this is something that like keeps coming up, and actually, so I had read this article a while back that talked about misinformation, the types of drivers of information, right? And definitely financial gain was one of these drivers. So in other words, that people would disseminate this misinformation for financial gain, either to like sell books or services or products, right? So that was one driver. But there were three other drivers, which I think we can talk about too. The first one was bad science, right? So bad science as a driver of misinformation. So what that means is like somebody with scientific credentials who basically like misrepresents the findings, right?
Like the article that linked vaccinations and autism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
that's been like completely repudiated, right?
Yes, it has, but it's done so much damage, right? It's done so much damage. So a scientist can write a paper, and like most everybody won't read the paper, right? I mean, there's few people, like only scientists will read the paper. So those findings had to be disseminated by somebody else, like the media, right? So the media takes hold of certain scientific findings and then will amplify, right, the message. Now, sometimes they misconstrue those findings to like sound sexy, and that way they get spread a lot easier. But it's something to keep in mind, right? So that's where like bad science kind of fits in, and it's not just the scientists, it's also the media, and there has to be better communication between the two, So yeah. The other one is political opportunity, right? So that's another big driver of misinformation. And so with political opportunity, people are kind of using emotional language to basically like polarize the population, right? So and as I mentioned before, like in order for us to like be effective at controlling a pandemic, at controlling an epidemic or an outbreak, you need that unified response by the people. So sometimes those like seeking political gain from this could be one of these drivers of misinformation. And then the last one is super spreaders, right? And I think that one's like probably a newer one, but I wonder if like throughout history there are examples of super spreaders. So these are people who are well connected and can amplify that misinformation to, you know, so like you have social media influencers and stuff like that. And so like I wonder how rampant, I think those other three we could have examples of, and you've already listed one of the examples, but I wonder if that like super spreader one is something that we'll see later on, I don't know.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I think like in an age of social media, it's possible for information to spread rapidly and far in a way that maybe wouldn't have been possible, and certainly not in the same way or at the same scale earlier. But I think, we can definitely see examples of misinformation spreading fast and through sort of word of mouth, like through sort of non-expert sources. So in this Liverpool example, I think the more interesting misinformation that got spread was really the cause of the riots. People were rioting because they thought that doctors were taking patients into hospitals to kill them so that they could dissect their bodies for science, which is just a terrifying thought. It turns out that this was not an unfounded fear, that there was a real basis for this idea that people were killing people for their bodies. 4 years prior, there was a man named William Burke in Edinburgh who, with a partner, murdered 16 people and sold their bodies to a medical school for anatomical dissection. And so this was in people's minds at this time, kind of close by in Liverpool. And we know this because the rioters would shout things like, "Here come the Burkers," when the doctors would come by. So we know that people were really afraid of this, but it was also not what was happening at that time.
They had cause for fear, right? Just like how in the West Africa, I keep going back to that one, but the West Africa outbreak, there was cause to not trust the government, like they weren't necessarily, in some places, hospitals weren't necessarily well equipped to like actually handle patients and that kind of thing, so there, I can see that, but I also see like how hard it would be to kind of change people's minds about that. So in the case of the Liverpool example, how was it that they approached this? Like, how did these riots stop?
So this is really interesting. The people who were rioting were the poorer folks, and a lot of them were Irish immigrants to the area. And they really stopped the riots pretty starkly, like they just were able to end them. What happened was an Irish man wrote a letter to the mayor of Liverpool and said, "I'm going to take drastic action if the doctors don't stop bringing people to the hospitals." And he signed it anonymously, but he just signed it an Irishman. So the government responded by going to the church, the Catholic Church. Most of the Irish were Catholic. And the next day, from the pulpit, the church made a statement. And the statement had three main messages. The first one was, this is a real epidemic. It's not fake. So they had this "it's a hoax" idea going around then too. The second was, look, there's been rumors about murders. That's not what's happening here. Like, we're talking to people in authority. This is not what's happening. And then the third was, in order to reassure you that your family members are not going to be like taken off for dissection against their will or murdered, families can visit sick people in the hospital daily. And if someone dies, you can see their body in an open casket before you bury them. And this kind of cleared it up. There was another thing that I think may have helped, a letter or an article written by a doctor about a week before, published in the newspaper, that said, actually, we don't really have a lot of medical students in Liverpool right now, so there's not really a need for bodies for anatomical study. So, rest assured on that front. But also, he said, we wouldn't want to dissect bodies of people who died from cholera. It's incredibly infectious. Like, we wouldn't want those bodies anyway. And some combination, but I think probably more the church's statement ended up just calming people's fears, and the riots ended.
Working with the community, doing that sort of like community engagement in a way that they would be receptive to it to help kind of squelch those fears. And that's something that like still, the WHO does that abroad in different countries where they work with community health workers to help, train them so that they're already like respected in their communities, and they can, kind of stop basically like provide good information to the communities from a trustworthy source that they believe in. Yeah. And then kind of stop misinformation that way. And I guess like here, our attempts, this is, an ongoing thing for us here. I know that like Twitter and Facebook have, made valiant strides to flag misinformation, disinformation. But still stuff gets through, and you have those influencers, those super spreaders that can get the word out. So, I mean, this is going to be such an interesting thing to look into in further detail, like with other pandemics, and I can't wait to work with you on that. Yeah.
Studying history helps us feel not alone. So we can, when we have these fears about our current pandemic, we can remember that, there are thousands of years of human history of people going through this kind of hard thing and feeling those fears, and we can have that kind of in common with our human siblings.